School of Public Policy at McGill, where I run the Center for Media Technology and Democracy. And part of the work we do is we run a project called the Media Ecosystem Observatory, which for the past few years has been studying the media ecosystem in Canada and the flow of mis and disinformation through it, and the effect that may have or may not have on our democratic society. And we've just finished a project on the last election, monitoring and studying the flows of disinformation through the last election. Previously, we've been working on the COVID pandemic and the way in which information flows were changing behavior within over the past 2 years, and before that, the last election in 2019. And so we thought now, I mean, we're about to issue this report on what we see as the state of mis and disinformation in Canada, and Angus, who directs our project, is going to speak to that. But we thought this would be a good chance to kind of check in with a community of people who work on the same challenge in Canada, and in various ways seek to understand it and help Canadians and our government and us better understand what's going on here. This has been a problem, like from a research perspective, that is very difficult to get a handle on. It is difficult to see because of the nature of where it's happening. A lot of our information about it comes from other countries. But increasingly, we're getting a capacity both from the journalistic community, the research community, civil society, the way government's starting to engage in this issue. We're getting a visibility of what Canadian mis and disinformation looks like, what the drivers of it are, where it's a problem and where it's not, how it compares to what we see in other countries, what our vulnerabilities are specifically here and what they aren't. And I think the people we have here can I think give us a really holistic view of the nature of this problem. So that's kind of what we're going to dive into for the next hour or so. So let me just do a super quick introduction to who's here. And then Justin has to jump off fairly soon, so we're going to start with him, get a little bit of a picture of what he's seeing at the moment. He's been more embedded in this issue, literally in these challenges than any of us in the past months and years. So we're going to hear from him a bit. Justin Ling is an award-winning investigative journalist who has recently been focusing a lot of his work on stories around mis and disinformation, conspiracy theories, extremism, and the communities, frankly, that are propagating this stuff, and trying to understand their motives, what drives them, and what the effect of their campaigns have been. Galit Domner is the director of the Center for International Digital Policy at Global Affairs Canada, which has been responsible for the G7 rapid response mechanism to counter foreign threats to democracy. So we're going to hear more about this program, but it's essentially a coordination mechanism for G7 countries to share information about threats to their democratic societies and specifically elections. So we're going to hear about that. Colette Bryn is a professor at the University of Laval and director of the Center for Media Studies. Holly Ann Garnett is an associate professor at the Royal Military College and co-directs the Election Integrity Project. So she's also, we have lots of interaction with her and her project, and she's going to speak specifically about what we've seen in terms of election threats over the past couple of elections and this most recent one. And Angus Bridgman is from McGill, works in our lab, and is the director of the Media Ecosystem Observatory here. So it's a pretty amazing group. I think we're going to get a pretty wide-ranging view of the nature of this problem in Canada, and I'm kind of excited to dive in with everybody. But Justin, since your time is limited, let me just start with you to help frame this a little bit. Okay, a lot of what we know about disinformation and believe about it comes from other countries. From studies of American elections and the rise of Donald Trump and extremism in the US and anti-vax content in the US and so on and so forth, Russian behavior. But it seems to me like you have a pretty good sense of how this problem is now homegrown and what elements of it are homegrown versus what's coming from outside. And I'm wondering how you'd characterize Canadian disinformation?
It's a good question, and I mean, let me first start off by saying I'm very sorry that I'm gonna have to leave a little bit early. I'm currently sitting in a very kind of sad industrial area in Virginia, just outside of DC, where I'm working on a story about American and Russian disinformation in the war in Ukraine. So hence why I have to run to a DoD facility in a little bit to try and kind of get my hand, get my head around some of the theories that have basically enabled Putin to continue kind of prosecuting this war. But I like the question because it's funny. I think I've been saying for months, that maybe for years now, that Canada has its own disinformation, misinformation problem, and that it is properly homegrown in a bunch of respects, as you say. But I think in the last couple of weeks, I may have shifted my stance a little bit. I'm not sure I any longer think there is a homegrown disinformation, misinformation problem. I think there is a globalized misinformation, disinformation problem. And there's a profound irony to this, right? Because those who promulgate these conspiracy theories, this misinformation, tend to be the anti-globalist actors, right? Globalism is a dirty word for many of these groups. And yet globalization—
they're benefiting from it, right?
It's exactly right. What NAFTA did for free trade and the WTO did for free trade. Many of these social media platforms that are becoming hotbeds for disinformation, misinformation, have helped globalize this problem in a massive sense. And what you've seen is really Canadian flares on certain aspects of this effort. And I'm talking about, for the next little bit, I think I'm going to keep saying misinformation, but what I'm really talking about is a huge spectrum from very earnest but mistaken misinformation, from conspiracy theories that are developed by people who are paranoid, and disinformation that is being ginned up by nefarious actors, state actors, and those who are looking to profit off of all this. So when I say one of them, I really am talking about all three for this moment anyway. And there's really Canadian flares to a bunch of this, right? There is a very sort of Canuck spin on how a lot of this stuff promulgates and gets spread around and takes root here. But there's also a ton of ways in which Canada becomes a particular hotbed and particular breeding ground for internationalist misinformation efforts, right? For a variety of reasons. Some of it's, we have an incredibly educated population that can put an incredibly kind of thoughtful veneer on some of these outlandish conspiracy theories. We have a real crossroads population. We have tons of Russophones, tons of Ukrainians, tons of French speakers, Spanish speakers, so on and so forth. And we have an incredibly media savvy population. There's a reason why Rumble, probably one of the most single important vectors for misinformation. It's basically a YouTube clone for anyone who's never used it, but it's a YouTube clone that does not police any content on its platform. It's based in Toronto, and it's probably one of the most important vectors for misinformation around the world right now. It's many users' go-to spot for spreading this sort of misinformation. We have media sources that have become international celebrities in this space, like Rebel News, Ezra Levant's Rebel Media, and we have publishing houses, clearing houses that peddle in this misinformation. Places like the Center for Research on Globalization, which will share any old conspiracy theory you want to throw at it. So there's a bunch of ways in which some of this stuff is Canada specific. There's a bunch of ways in which Canada has just put a spin on a story that's floating internationally. And there's a bunch of ways where Canada is contributing and feeding into misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories that are being popularized around the world. So I think we kind of have to stop looking at this in very narrow senses. It's not a specifically Canadian problem. It's not specifically a homegrown problem. It's not specifically an American problem. It is a global problem of which Canada is a major player.
Yeah. And in some ways, so you've been tracking conspiracy theories for a long time, and these have been around for a long time, and there's a long history to why they propagate and why, certainly the Canadian flair to them has always been there to a certain degree. But there seems to be something different going on now, where these aren't just sort of a small community of people sitting online. This stuff is becoming normalized into our politics and into our public life, and it's coming into our streets, like you reported on in Ottawa. And like, how has that changed? We've moved from like fringe conspiracy online ideas to a tool of political mobilization and potential violence, even in our real public sphere.
There's some ways in which this is not new at all, right? So I host a podcast called The Flamethrowers that looks at the history of right-wing radio. And in many ways, the popularization of conservative talk radio had a very similar impact in this space as the increasing popularity of many social media platforms. But in the mid-90s, there was this emerging idea that there was a global plot to destroy American sovereignty. And this was being done through everything from the World Trade Organization to the Bilderberg group to a whole bunch of shadowy bodies. The Rothschilds family had a hand in this. And there was a thin veneer of anti-Semitism that went behind all of this. But the allegation that's popping up on a bunch of these, specifically shortwave radio broadcasts, that says the UN and the WTO and all these other groups are conspiring with Bill Clinton, and there is going to be a move very shortly to take your guns away, to destroy our sovereignty. And every single thing that happened in the news became evidence for that. The 93 World Trade Center bombing. There was many people, it's bizarre to think about, but many people thought it was not, in fact, Islamist terrorists, it was not Al-Qaeda, it was not Palestinian, pro-Palestinian terror entities. It was, in fact, the US government who was doing this as a pretext to seize weapons. Same with the siege at Waco. And these broadcasters went on the airwaves sounding very much like things you listen to nowadays that are on Alex Jones. And in fact, Alex Jones had got his career off of the back of this movement. But this movement was increasingly popular. You actually saw elected representatives, mostly in the state houses, but to some degree the House of Representatives, lending credence to this. You saw them effectively endorsing this militia movement. You saw a deep paranoia run through the center of American politics in the mid-90s, and it culminated in the Oklahoma City bombing. The Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols were steeped in this conspiracy theory. They listened to the broadcasters who were spreading this misinformation, and you saw that movement slowly morph from shortwave radio and mail order newsletters and mail order tapes into Usenet forums, into the internet, and it lost prominence in the years that followed. But you're seeing a recombination of exactly that movement today. The Patriot movement of the 90s has reimagined itself into what Donald Trump calls the deep state, what QAnon calls, this Satanist conspiracy, and what is increasingly becoming the allegation that the World Economic Forum is in control of our government and maybe all world governments, and that COVID-19 is either designed or being used to destroy our civil liberties and to impose what they keep saying is a Chinese-style social credit system. This is the new normal for a subset of our population that only spends their time listening to like-minded individuals, who only spend their time reading conspiracy theories, who only spend their time watching their favorite vloggers explain how our sovereignty and our freedoms are just one false flag away from being totally eviscerated. And it is a really worrying trend. And disinformation, misinformation, and these conspiracy theories are the glue that holds all this together. They're the glue that holds this movement together. If you're not constantly digesting this stuff, if you're not constantly being told you can't trust the mainstream media, can't trust the politicians, if you're not constantly being beat over the head with the idea that every single bad thing that happens in the world is evidence that the conspiracy theory is afoot, then you start to drift away from it. So this stuff is all this is cult tactics. This is how you radicalize and indoctrinate people, and it's incredibly effective. And we've never had a system that can do it so consistently. Shortwave radio, you can only broadcast so many hours a day. Eventually, you're going to turn the radio off. We now have a device in our pockets. We have a device in our backpacks, that can feed us this stuff in massive quantities, 24 hours a day, and people are fully being part of it. And I think the convoy in Ottawa became the perfect embodiment of this. Not only did you spend all of your days on the streets of Ottawa engaging with other people who believe the same, you listened to live streamers who told you about the World Economic Forum, indoctrinating our government. You exclusively read news from the rebel media that says the government was going to use this as a pretext to destroy our civil liberties. You're constantly hearing from Randy Hillier, who's in the streets, yammering on about how this is the last stand against tyranny. And it is a really worrying trend, and we've never seen this before, and I don't know what the consequences are going to be.
Yeah. I mean, one more question, I guess, and we can let you go and turn to others. But it seems over the past, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, we've engaged with this. We've interpreted the level of threat and potential risk coming from this in different ways, and it's kind of come in waves where people have maybe overstated the potential threat to elections, and then we've sort of pulled back a bit and claimed that there really wasn't one. And it feels around the convoy, we're now at a point where we've sort of seen a real potential physical manifestation of some of this stuff. And I think you've really helped us understand, frankly, the nature of that threat and what that looks like when it sort of breaks out into our politics. And I'm wondering how you think about this level of threat right now. Like when you think about the state of our democracy, and like how do you define this threat, and how should we be thinking about its significance?
Yeah, and I think, I think for a long time we overstated the threat because we exclusively thought about this under the guise of a foreign actor coming in and using these tactics to influence our politics to their end. And I think it really fundamentally misunderstands how most people engage with this stuff, right? Like the simple reality is that actually, here's a great example. Russia is really bad at disinformation. I know that sounds like a wild thing to say at the moment, but they are. They're genuinely incompetent at convincing large swaths of the population to get behind their conspiracy theories or their disinformation. But here's where they're really good at. They're really good at planting the seeds and letting us water it, right? And that's fundamentally what happened. The reason I'm in Virginia right now, the reason I unfortunately have to bail out on you fairly soon, is because if for the past decade, Moscow has started promoting the theory that the US is developing biological weapons in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus in order to target ethnic Slavic people. And truth be told, no one really bought this because it's complete nonsense. I'm not even sure the Russians expected anyone to buy it. I think in many ways, it was just a line they wanted to use to escape scrutiny of, frankly, a bioweapons program we know they're running. So as the drumbeat for war in the last couple of months started getting louder and louder, you started seeing a couple of individuals who are known peddlers of Russian disinformation start bringing this up more frequently. Russia is doing biological experiments on Ukrainian soldiers. The biological labs could release the next version of COVID-19, doing a little linkage to the belief that COVID-19 is not just an outpouring from nature, but is in fact designed in a lab or leaked from a lab. Russia did not, at a state level, did not really engage with this. They were too busy talking about denazification and alleging Ukraine was shelling their own hospitals. Again, stuff nobody buys, or very few people buy. But what you saw is the first day of the war, an American, a QAnon believer, who, as best I can tell, has no ties to Russian intelligence or anything Russian for that matter. I don't think he reads Russian, but he puts out the idea that maybe Putin is invading Ukraine in order to take out biological laboratories that are seeding the next pandemic. And frankly, it's ludicrous. And it takes a couple days. It starts filtering through the convoy channels, which has become one of the most important vectors right now for global misinformation, are the huge Telegram channels that were set up in support of the convoy and the occupation in Ottawa and the US and Australia and elsewhere. So it starts spreading like wildfire through there. As the days go by, you start seeing other QAnon conspiracy theorists, places like Infowars, other vectors of misinformation start sharing it. Then you see the Russian government realize they have something good going on. That's when you see Sputnik News jump in and start engaging with the conspiracy theory. That's when you see former President Dmitry Medvedev start talking about it in interviews. That's when you see Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, go into a press conference and say, we're very concerned about biological weapons in Ukraine. And then it becomes the official stance of the Russian government. And again, they're not going to convince 50% of America or Canada, but they have successfully won over 10 to 20% of the country. Marjorie Taylor Greene, member of the House of Representatives, is now espousing this conspiracy theory. You have Steve Bannon, Peter Navarro, two former Donald Trump White House officials, Tucker Carlson, one of the most influential late news or news TV hosts in America. This all started with Russia seeding tiny little bits of disinformation for years, but fundamentally letting an American take it and run with it, and then repurposing what he has already kind of packaged for them. And so sometimes I try really hard to forge a distinction between misinformation and disinformation, but frankly, in a lot of times there is no meaningful difference. One feeds into the other, and the other feeds back to the first one. And conspiracy theories are just the stories that make both of those things palatable to the public, and that's where we're at. And we are incredibly adept at falling for this stuff. And we are incredibly, and our own citizens are incredibly adept at spinning these tales. And the more this happens, the more we're going to see the consequences. And none of this gets created to win or lose elections. No one cares. None of these people care about elections, because frankly, they keep losing them. They had a candidate in 2019, he got 6% of the vote. So it was even 6%, maybe it was less than that. Their end goal is not at the ballot box. Their end goal is to continue building out a movement that for them is grassroots, that is incredibly organic, and they want to continue applying pressure. And frankly, they want to continue telling themselves that they have levers that go beyond government, because they see government as corrupt. The number of people who were involved in the Ottawa occupation who said repeatedly, the last election was illegitimate, Justin Trudeau is illegitimate. The number of people involved in that movement who believe that the Prime Minister has committed crimes against humanity and ought to be locked up, has also committed treason, so on and so forth. The number of people who believe that they have a legal mechanism that they can use to remove the government and do so peacefully and legally and in the proper way, it's really prevalent. So fundamentally, these people are looking to exist beyond the system. They don't care about elections. They don't care about the media. They don't care about institutions. They're building their own system, and they're convincing themselves that it has authority and legitimacy. And that, to me, is one of the most terrifying things about all of this. Because if you believe your system confers onto you authority, if you believe you can deputize your own police officers, if you believe you exist outside of the realm of the state, then who can tell you that what you're doing is illegal, wrong, dangerous, or bad, right? You exist in a different universe. And I'm really worried about where that ends up.
Yeah. I share that concern. And look, thanks for joining us.
I'm so sorry I had to bail it. Otherwise,
project,
really...
and we're going to continue on, but feel free to jump off anytime. But really, thank you very much for setting the stage with us here. And
thank you so much for having me. I look forward to doing something else like this in the future. But
we definitely will. I have to. All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. All right. Look, there's a million different directions we can head here. But I actually want to start, Colette, with you and this idea of where we are in terms of, building a bit on that final trust point from Justin, of that for a long time, we've been really struck in our work the levels of trust in media and journalism in Canada, and that might have really provided some buffer for us to this problem, where in the US, if trust is 10% of Americans trust media, and in Canada it's 80%, that's a very different playing field in which mis and disinformation flows. And you've been looking for so long time. I'm wondering how you would characterize both the Canadian recent declines in trust in journalism and how that plays into this problem of too many people believing false things.
Yeah, it's still certainly better than the US, but again, it really depends on who you're comparing to, and comparing to what it used to be like in Canada. There's definitely been a decline in the last few years. I guess the question is, what is the cause of that, and what does that mean in terms of misinformation, or what role does misinformation play in that? And it's really hard to take apart, like Justin was just saying, even taking apart misinformation and disinformation is not a simple thing. And, I tend to think of misinformation as both a cause and a symptom, because of course, misinformation creates distrust, but it's also the place that people turn to when they're already distrustful. And listening to Justin, I was wondering about, how many of these people are that radical in their beliefs that they've completely turned away from the media. And of course, the findings we have are from surveys. So it's possible that people are just not responding. People that radical are just not responding to surveys. But our findings are still that most people are tuning in to legacy sources, whether online or whatever. There's still a lot of that, even if most people are getting news online.
Is trust
and the
even
kind of people
irrelevant?
who are like really into conspiracy theories are still a small minority. It's not to say that it's not a cause for concern, but it's trying to get a sense of how big this problem is, and is it growing, which is hard.
Yeah. Is trust even a relevant variable here? I mean, if people who watch Tucker Carlson trust Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, well, we asked 2 questions in the digital news report. One is trust in news overall.
Yeah.
So that's really a general, the media, and then trust that in the news that you select. And of course, there's a difference. Of course, it's higher for what people consume, but the difference is typically not so big. It's about 5 percentage points. So people who consume more news tend to be more trusting in general, but it's kind of a chicken and egg thing.
Yeah. Look, so I mean, a lot of the context for our work and for the work of people in our group here has been around elections, and I actually think they have been a really important vector for this, because in elections is when the reliability of information is paramount. I mean, that's the whole point of an election, is we all need to agree on some basic things in order to make collective decisions together. So I think understanding this problem within elections is really important, just to understand the character of this problem. And Holly, I wonder if you could start first on what you've learned about the role of mis and disinformation in Canada over the last couple of elections that you've been looking at them. Can you just kind of summarize your perspective on this?
Absolutely, thank you. So most of the way that I come to this issue of mis and disinformation is through the lens of elections. And really, if I can kind of backtrack a little bit, for a lot of scholars, that really came onto our radar around 2016, the American presidential election in 2016. It wasn't something that was really considered as much in terms of standards for elections and things that we should necessarily be looking at. And so leading up to the 2019 Canadian election, the CSE, of course, released a report saying that there was this issue that we might be seeing these clear issues of mis and disinformation leading up to the 2019 election. Apologies. And if I can kind of plug a book that's coming out in the spring on cyber threats to Canadian democracy, co-edited with Mike Powell. We looked at the 2019 election, which was supposed to be this first election that we were going to see these huge issues of mis and disinformation, and it was largely kind of a non-issue for 2019. We didn't see what we expected to see. We didn't see what happened in the United States. There was definitely harmful speech. There was definitely a couple of issues with news stories that weren't true, but largely we didn't see what we expected to. And then 2020 happened, the 2020 American election, issues with the pandemic, people largely sitting at home and getting their information only online. And largely where I come to this is the issue of how people get information about the voting process, because that's a huge area that actively can influence the quality of an election. And so in the American 2020 election, there was a lot of disinformation about the voting process, being manipulated for political gain, about the safety of a postal voting process, because there were so many people voting by post because of the pandemic, about vote tampering. Of course, this issue with the Dominion voting machines, which, were made in Canada, I guess. Not really, but anyway, so this sort of issue came up, and I think largely what happened is we saw that spill over into the 2021 election. It wasn't necessarily something coming from Canadian concerns, but was a spillover because we consume so much American media and don't often think of ourselves as that different, even though our electoral systems and the way we run elections is just so fundamentally different. Having one electoral management body, a consistent system across the country, a different electoral system. But many Canadians thought what was happening in the States was happening in Canada as well, even though it was almost impossible in many cases. And then because of the pandemic, because there's a lot of concern about public safety and health, and people turning to special ballots, because of that, there's this issue of, is my special ballot going to actually get my postal ballot, going to get where it needs to go? And Canadians were then affected by that rhetoric. And there's already going to be some decline in trust when you're voting by post, as opposed to physically putting a ballot in a ballot box. There's some research that shows that when you're not doing that physical, tangible thing, there's going to be some increase in distrust. And so with all of these issues together, we started to see some of the same sorts of rhetoric happening in Canada as were happening in the United States. But then to this question of like, should we be concerned? Did it actually end up influencing the election that much? You know, it's hard to predict, but actually, I would say in the end, it probably didn't end up making as big of an influence as we thought it might have, largely because our electoral system was able to blunt the effects of it. Because even if the People's Party, you know, because of some of the COVID disinformation going around, was able to get a higher percentage of the vote, our electoral system is really good at blunting the extremes of the spectrum. And so largely in Canada, for whatever reason, we aren't seeing the same sorts of issues that we saw, for example, in the American elections, even if we do see some spillover effects. So that would be kind of my analysis of what happened kind of from the 2016 up until our most recent election.
How would you know if it was having an effect on the election? What are you looking for as a lever there that would really show you that it had affected an election?
Yeah, so I guess what I would be looking for regarding people not being able to vote or information being so factually incorrect that people were not actually able to vote, and seeing media reports, for example, or Twitter feeds saying that the people are not actually able to cast their ballot. And we largely didn't see that. There were some issues, obviously, with postal ballots getting in late and them not being counted, for example. But the actual issue of people not knowing how to go and vote wasn't necessarily the thing. And then regarding, you know, the issue of how the campaign got influenced by it, I mean, that's beyond my pay grade, I think. Really difficult to see. But even if we see kind of which parties found success, like I mentioned, because of some of the pandemic information that was coming out that ended up leading to larger support of the People's Party. Again, that got blunted by the electoral system. And so, you know, if we were, for example, to see some of these more extreme parties getting more power in the House of Commons, then I would start to get a little more concerned about the influence. But obviously, it's one of those, again, very difficult things to actually measure. Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect transition to Angus looking at how to measure this stuff. So for those of you who don't know, Angus has been running the Media Observatory Project, which is a partnership between our lab at McGill and Peter Lowen's lab at the University of Toronto that does a fair amount of survey work on this. And I wonder, Angus, if you could sort of reflect even a bit, build on what Holly said there. That, I mean, I think you found similar things, right? That some of these direct effects might not have been observable, but that there are some other concerns with this kind of content circulating through our society during an election. Can you kind of characterize those concerns?
Yeah, absolutely, and maybe talk a little bit about the measures. I laugh because, you know, in 2019 we looked at misinformation in the election. You know, we were part of a project, a large project looking at that, and there was very little. And I remember after the election, being in a room in Toronto with about 150 other people, and there was a panel of 4 journalists talking about how much misinformation there was during the 2019 election. And I remember sitting there sort of looking around at my colleagues who were part of it. Wait, what election just happened? Like, were we part of the same election? There was this real sincere belief amongst journalists with the misinformation beat that there had been a lot of misinformation. You know, if you hunt for misinformation, you will find misinformation. I mean, this is like absolutely true. You can poke in the dark corners of the internet and find, you know, all sorts of falsehoods. That doesn't mean it's a huge problem. And so, you know, you have to measure it. You have to try to evaluate it. There's those journalists talking though, and I think there's just like another piece of sort of misinformation that circulated after the 2021 election, which reminded me of it, which is I don't know if people are familiar with Blacklocks, but it's sort of a media outlet in Canada that primarily functions by like access to information requests, and then takes the information given and just impressively takes it out of context, and then, you know, pushes that out on Twitter or on their site, and can really lead to some misperceptions. And so after the ballot, after the election, there was this claim that there were 200,000 ballots lost in the Canadian election, that somehow you know, like, what happened to these mail-in ballots, and that was like enough to make the difference in the election. That was the reason for the outcome of the election. There was this claim that was posted on Twitter and got a huge amount of attention from sort of the community that is predisposed to believing in this stuff. This community can walk away from that misinformation having this belief that the election was manipulated in some way. So it's very easy, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, to get exposed to these narratives that like either misinformation directly or that misinformation really matters to the election. And that has a cumulative dangerous effect where people slowly, their confidence in democracy, their confidence in the electoral process gets degraded. We need that. No, please stop that. Like that's very important, that confidence in democracy. That's sort of critical. And what we do see actually is a bit of an erosion. So we ran large scale surveys of the Canadian population. I think there's some really good questions about like the extent to which those surveys capture particular niche populations. But in general, we see even amongst sort of all Canadians, we saw about 70% of Canadians were confident that the election was run well and that elections Canada did a great job. 70% is great, right? That's a very high number, except when you think, actually, that means 30% either don't think or are not sure. And 30% of adult Canadians, that's 10 million. That's 10 million Canadians, right? And if that number keeps inching up election after election, we're potentially in trouble. So we can measure there. The other way we can potentially measure how some of this misinformation matters, and we try to do this during the election, is you try to sort of have these daily surveys throughout the election capturing attitudes, and you look for sort of important events, and then you try to capture whether or not there's a change, right? And you can try to do this. And the reality is most misinformation circulates in a very tiny community of people who already have attitudes predisposed to believing that misinformation. So what it means is that any difference in attitude in that community as a result of that information is going to be negligible for any particular event. So particular piece of misinformation, I think it's basically impossible to measure, impossible to really understand their impact, but you can see them spilling out into the information ecosystem, and you can sort of feel their weight election after election, poll after poll. And so that's kind of where I think we can examine this stuff. There's one other thing I want to say about this, which is that I'm a political scientist. Like, we're obsessed with like studying population level attitudes, and like population level attitudes are incredibly important because that's the entire voting population. We want to know that the majority of Canadians is like still, but if you have 5 to 10% of Canadians that have like seriously different factual interpretations of our political life, 5 to 10% of adult Canadians is like 6 or 7 million people. Like this is not a small number of people. My math is wrong there. 3 million people. 3 million people. It's such a large number that
you're a political scientist, not
a mathematician.
Not a mathematician.
So 3 million people, and actually what we saw, I think, with the Truckers for Freedom rally is that you don't need 3 million people. You actually just need a few hundred really dedicated, fervent believers, and they can shape political discourse. And so one of the things,
particularly if they believe things like the government is illegitimate, or that certain beliefs could become more pernicious in a small minority of people if they believe them, right? But another
absolutely.
thing I want to just highlight that you breezed over there quickly, but I think it's really important, is I think there's a perception that the left thinks misinformation is a problem on the right, and that's how this discourse gets framed in the media. But you found that everybody across the political spectrum thinks misinformation is a problem for other people, and it's strongest amongst PPC party supporters. So the people who think misinformation is the biggest problem in this country are PPC supporters. They just think it's other parties who are subjected to this misinformation or a victim of it. But what does it tell us about our democracy if everybody thinks everybody else is misinformed?
It's a great question. It sort of answers itself, right? I mean, it's
was
not
a
good.
rhetorical question.
It's not good. Well, fair enough.
But this is a classic concept in communication. It's called the third party effect. So it's always other people who are vulnerable to whatever communication problem there is.
Right.
Taylor, can I just hop in on the question?
I was just going to give it to you anyway, so you go first and then I'll ask you another question.
Great. I was just going to hop in on the question that both Angus and Holly were addressing in terms of what degree is Canada really a target of disinformation. And I don't want to mix up the apples and the oranges here, because the work that I do at the Department of Foreign Affairs is understandably focused on foreign state-sponsored disinformation. So the stuff that our adversaries are leveraging, right? And I just say, when we think about threat to Canada, because of course everybody was concerned after the 2016 election in the States, and not just 2016, we saw the Brexit referendum, we saw the Macron leaks, right, in 2017, we saw some good examples again in 2020 in the US midterm elections, and those are like close to home examples. Of course, there's all sorts of disinformation in elections around the world and all kinds of foreign interference, right? So understandably, Canadians are concerned. But I think when you try to answer the question, to what degree are Canadians a target, you have to really think about the threat. And the threat, and I don't need to tell either this panel or this audience, for sure, is always a combination of capability and intent when we're talking about our adversaries, right? Are adversaries capable? Absolutely, right? I think the Russian state has really led the charge on disinformation over the ages, but their so-called Kremlin playbook is out there, and folks have access to it. So the capability is there. I think the question then is the intent, right? Is it worth it to these actors to take the risk of interfering in our elections? Are the stakes high enough for them? And so I'd say a few things there. I think our intelligence agencies have been pretty clear in some of the public reports that Holly mentioned earlier that Canada is less of a target relative to other democracies. And if you think about the elections last year in 2021, the Germans were on the campaign trail at the same time, and they saw a lot of Russian disinformation via RT and otherwise, right? You also already had a lot of forward planning with respect to French elections this year and US midterms. So when you look at Canada in the context, and all of our adversaries have limited resources, right? Where are they going to spend their time, and where can they get sort of the biggest bang? So I think it's important to keep that in mind when we think about Canada as a target. But that is not to say that we shouldn't be clear-eyed about the threat and its evolution, right? Because just because we're not in the crosshairs today, it doesn't mean we won't be tomorrow. These things change really quickly, and it means we have to be proactive, right, in safeguarding our elections and our democracy.
Can you talk a little bit about the work you do to be proactive here? I mean, I some people might not know about the work that you're doing, and in global affairs in particular, just to both collaborate with other governments, but also to look very specifically at the Canadian context.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me, it's kind of a whole of government effort. In fact, we always talk about the need for a whole of society effort, right? Because the government is not going to be the arbiter and purveyor of truth, and citizens are just as responsible for the information, right, that circulates online. So I'd love to take the opportunity to talk about what my team does. Let me just put it in context. So about a few of the different things that the government's up to. I think we have taken a whole bunch of steps, which is really great. And I think we've probably done that in three areas. And the first one, and I think this is the most important one, is fostering societal resilience, because I think this is our first and best line of defense, right? So our Department of Heritage launched the Digital Citizen Initiative, right, which has promoted civic news and digital media literacy training for like a third of all Canadians. And they also launched the Digital Citizen Research Program, right, that supports a community of Canadian researchers that help Canadians to understand the impact of online disinformation. And there's also been in recent years something like 50 million in support to local journalism. So again, really can't emphasize enough the critical role that media and civil society and groups like the Media Ecosystem Observatory play in countering disinformation. And then second of all, the government did launch its Protecting Democracy Plan back in 2019, and it updated it again in 2021 ahead of our last federal election. And at the heart of the plan is this critical election incident public protocol. So it's a big term for what is essentially a panel of the most senior civil servants in Canada. So the clerk sits on this panel and 4 deputy ministers. And it's their job to alert Canadians if the integrity of an election has been compromised. And this is really important because during a caretaker period, when folks in government are on the campaign trail and when they really have skin in the game, right, in determining whether there's there's been foreign interference in an election, you have this sort of impartial panel of senior civil servants, and they are supported by a security and intelligence task force, right? So that's CSIS and CSE and RCMP and my team as well. And what we are doing is providing them with real-time intelligence, 24/7, very regular reporting, working literally around the clock about what we're seeing in terms of foreign interference. Not just in terms of disinformation, but foreign interference writ large, so that they can make the call as to whether in any way the integrity of the election has been compromised. So the role of my team, our team is called the Rapid Response Mechanism Canada, which in turn leads the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism. My team includes a number of super data analysts who are looking at the online information environment for indicators of foreign interference, right? And then sharing them with the intelligence community and sharing them with this panel. Then I'd also say the government, and I'm sure everybody read about this, also established the Canada Declaration on Electoral Integrity Online. So this is a voluntary code between government and social media companies where we're supposed to support principles of integrity and transparency and authenticity. So that sort of infrastructure that we put into place for elections is super helpful. And I just think finally, and going back to the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism, when G7 leaders met back in 2018, it was after what we had just talked about, right? Seeing interference in the US elections and Brexit and French elections. And there was this enough is enough sentiment, right, among G7 leaders, and this recognition we could no longer be ad hoc, right, about countering foreign threats to democracy like disinformation, and that more international collaboration was really necessary. So they stood up the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism and agreed that Canada would lead this table on an ongoing basis. And so what this mechanism, as you said, Taylor, does is it really provides a table for G7 countries, and there's a few observers at the table as well, to sit down, share real-time assessments, national best practices, and to discuss joined up responses. And so actually we have our first public report is coming out on disinformation this spring. So please keep an eye on it. And as I said, my team leads the G7 RRM, including these data analysts that we have on our team that contribute to the effort. But it is quite a big, broad mechanism that does a number of things. So as you can imagine, we're all around the clock right now with respect to the Russia-Ukraine crisis.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the Ukraine issue in a minute. But just first on this comparative piece, Holly, I'm curious, I mean, you've looked at this problem in other elections clearly, and some of how you study the Canadian election is informed by what has happened in other elections. I mean, that's how we learn of these threats. We don't just look at one context, but I'm wondering how you view that connection. Like, are we seeing the same things in other countries? Does it inform how we should understand our own vulnerabilities, or are these things really nationally idiosyncratic? How do you view that connection?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And in preparation for this panel, I went to look at our Perceptions of Electoral Integrity Index. So the Electoral Integrity Project does essentially an expert survey after every election. It's been going on since 2012. And thankfully, between 2017 and 2019, we did have a special battery looking at these sorts of issues of cybersecurity, information environment, mis and disinformation. So I just pulled it up to see, where does Canada sit when we look at the world? And 83% of elections in that time period, the experts agreed or strongly agreed that social media often contained fake news, that this disinformation issue was a key issue in the election. Interestingly, in 2019, Canada was one of those places where the average response was quite lower, that most people didn't agree or disagree that particularly this disinformation issue was a big deal for the Canadian election. Unfortunately, the rotating battery switched to issues of COVID and emergency conditions, so we don't have 2021 data. But one thing we notice around the globe is that, and I often say this, the easiest way to manipulate an election, if you'd like to, if you're a domestic actor or a foreign actor, is to manipulate the information environment. Don't go rigging ballot boxes or any of those sorts of official things. That'll just get you caught, and it won't actually achieve your goals. But influencing voters. And one of the things that we notice around the world as well is that the traditional ways that we monitor elections don't necessarily capture this information environment, which is now the best way to start influencing an election. And so international organizations are trying to come up with new sorts of protocols they can use in order to monitor how this issue is affecting elections. But like, before we say it's all bad news, I think Canada has a few things in our courts that helps us out regarding this issue. The first is that we do have a highly trusted and well-resourced election management body with consistent voting process and procedures across the country. So that does prevent some of those issues of spillover from different counties and confusion even just about how your voting process is going to work from being a huge issue here in Canada. And also allows Elections Canada to get in front of it a little bit, because they are pretty well-resourced and a permanent organization that's independent from government. I think we do see a pretty motivated traditional media sector that is looking to dispel these sorts of myths. I know Angus and myself, and I know Colette does as well, gets a lot of media requests during the election to debunk any of these sorts of issues. As Galit mentioned, we have clear mechanisms in place. I think that's one of the key issues, is to know before it happens, what are we going to do when there is an issue that meets the threshold that we need to intervene. It hasn't been used to my knowledge yet, at least in a way that most Canadians would be aware. So we'll see about that. And then, yeah, referring back to what Galit said about it being not necessarily Canada being as high up on the target list. So it's actually less of a concern. Maybe I'm just being the perpetual optimist in the group today, but maybe there are a lot of things in Canada's court that help mitigate some of these issues that we see becoming far more important and far more consequential for electoral integrity in other countries.
Yeah. Colette, are some of those distinctions between international and Canadian also present between English Canada and French Canada? Like,
yeah,
how do you view those differences between those two phenomena of English and French disinformation?
Traditionally, it's been the Francophone environment. There's been a higher level of trust in media, and also a higher level of local media use. So we're not as exposed to I'm talking about Francophone Quebec, of course, but not as exposed to the US disinformation content, the English language content. But what we do have is the homegrown recyclers of that kind of content, who give it a local flavor and make it all that much more efficient, because it speaks to local concerns. And we've seen a lot of that during the pandemic. And we also have, of course, our own conservative talk radio, especially in Quebec City, where I live, which have been very active long before the internet, and have been involved also in elections, especially at the riding level and at the municipal level. And they have had seem to have had some success, because it's always very hard to measure that kind of effect. Yeah. But their influence has actually been waning in recent years, or they're softening their style.
Why is that, do you think?
What we're seeing now,
because that really has been such a vector of it. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Why is that, do you think? Why is that softening?
Well, because younger people aren't listening to traditional radio, and also because the radio environment has become, radio listeners have become older, and maybe less. There are a few of those hosts still playing that. And actually, we have a provincial Conservative Party now, which is led by a former radio host and media personality, who is certainly one of the leaders of recycling those kinds of disinformation discourses, and has been very successful in adapting the anti-pandemic or anti-public health measures to his political gain, and is actually running second in the polls. Now we're having an election in October, and he's running second in the polls. He's getting a lot of donations, a lot of new memberships. This is a party that was basically dormant for many, many years. So we'll see. I think it's still kind of, I'm like Holly, I'm fairly optimistic in our processes, in also the overall capacity of not only our electoral system, but also the media and our environment ecosystem, which is fairly small, and there's a lot of media surveillance. Angus was talking about journalists making a big deal about misinformation elections and maybe overplaying it. And I've certainly seen that in Quebec as well, that as soon as there's one small little thing happening on social media, they're all over it, and they make a big deal out of it, which is good because it gets exposed. but also maybe there's a bit of exaggeration. And that's the kind of thing I tend to say when I give interviews to the media, is not to overstate a single example of misinformation.
Yeah, but these shiny objects can be difficult to to put down sometimes. Look, I want to start bringing some questions in from the chat. I've been trying to follow a few of them. But there's one, if I can stick with you, Colette, for a minute, there's one here that I'd like to address to you. That, I mean, there's a comment here about the role that cable news plays in the United States in their journalism ecosystem, or in their kind of more traditional media ecosystem. And we haven't really had the equivalent of that here. We haven't had yes, we've had talk radio that's done that a little more so in Quebec than other places, but we haven't had a Fox News North. So when you look at the broad journalism space in Canada, how do you view its role in this problem?
Okay, in the absence of that kind of a Fox News.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I try not to assign blame. I work a lot in partnership with media, and I also chair the advisory board for the tax credits. So I try to stay neutral on that as well. But on a more, say, systemic scale, for sure, the fact that media have been losing money, have been cutting back on newsrooms, have been working faster and doing more things on multiple platforms certainly didn't help. I think it's their capacity to do depth was reduced. I mean, I think that's an objective thing that you can see. That's not, I don't think anyone is going to throw a stone at me for saying that. So in that sense, the media are part of the problem. They also are not infallible, and I think they would, in most cases, be considered, sources of misinformation and not disinformation, in the sense that they would get a story wrong, or not get the right context, or not willingly take things out of context, but just not provide really, all the facts or all the important facts. So, I mean, this is a problem with journalism in general. It's not, you're not writing a thesis when you do a piece of journalism. You do it in very difficult context. Some people think that something like solutions journalism would be a solution, because it's evidence-based, because it brings out positive and hopeful solutions or positive outcomes. And that could contribute to reducing the kind of cynicism that people have towards institutions and the media. I mean, I think the jury's still out on that, but I'm open to any kind of constructive suggestion.
Well, we know the government's developing policy in that space too, so maybe that could address that kind of supply side, not just the demand side of this issue.
Taylor, can I just jump in on that question as well?
Sure thing.
I think maybe historically it was true, and your question sort of implies this, Stephanie, that a lot has changed since 2015. So, we closely look at the people who sort of hold the largest misperceptions and who propagate the most misinformation online. And, we call them like misinformed and misinforming communities. And they will maybe get clips from cable news. They might see a clip of Tucker Carlson, or they might see a clip of media outlet X, Y, or Z. But that's not really where the action is. That's not where the excitement is in these communities. And where the excitement is are sort of the, video essays, Telegram channels. Like the space has moved considerably, even since sort of 2019, when we really last took a detailed look at an election. So I guess my response is, we don't need that. We don't need a Fox News North to have a community that is deeply attached to these ideas and is going, and the do your own research crowd that is going out into the internet and searching for narratives that are counter in many ways to what other media outlets are saying. There is a level of distrust in this community that where if a media outlet says something, they are predisposed to not believing it. It's not just a question of like, I don't trust that media outlet, so I'm not going to read that. It's like, I read that, I'm going to believe the opposite because I know that they're lying to me. And there's that very strong perception. And we've seen this, like, maybe we can talk a little bit more about Russian disinformation in the context of the Ukrainian invasion, but like, we've seen this where people say things like, all of the media are lined up against Russia. There's something going on here. This is suspicious. This is an indication that this is, propaganda, or that, and so we need to talk about alternatives. And you see sort of, if anyone wants to, I'm not promoting viewing misinformation, but like go on Rumble during the day and watch a live stream for 5 minutes. And
really
what you will,
something.
it's really something. You will really see kind of, this is where a lot of the action, somebody like Glenn Greenwald on there will get 20, 30,000 views for a live video in the middle of the day. And he's going through it sort of like a video essay format. And the bottom line is he's saying, the media is lying to you. The media is lying to you. The media is lying to you. And there's this repeated refrain. And so, we don't need a cable TV channel. These people are technologically sophisticated. They're going into all sorts of different platforms, and they don't need that single source of truth anymore. They can find and create their own.
They don't, but I'm sure it didn't hurt having Tucker Carlson every night.
No.
Endorsing the convoy. That still plays a role in some capacity, even though it didn't spur it. But Galit, on this, on the case of Ukraine and Russian disinformation at the moment, you look at foreign, your mandate is to look at foreign policy and foreign interference. And how do you deal with a problem that involves a foreign actor, but has domestic elements to it and might be coming from allied countries or internally itself? How do you even think about Russian disinformation when it sits in this ambiguous domestic international space?
Wow, that's a super good question. So obviously Russian disinformation, I know Justin feels that the Russians don't do it particularly well. I'd probably beg to differ. I think the Global Engagement Center in the US did a great report a year ago that really spells out the pillars of Russian disinformation and the way the Russian disinformation machine works, right? They've got the first pillar, which is official government communications. So think of some of the recent communications we've seen by Russia's ambassador to Canada in the context of the invasion. They've got state-funded global messaging, so foreign broadcasting like RT, but not just RT, Sputnik for that matter. And then they cultivate proxy sources, right? And here I'm thinking about some of the dodgy think tanks. Justin talked a little bit about this, that they sort of prop up and create that then amplify and echo their messages. Then there's the weaponization of social media. We've already talked a lot about that. And then the cyber-enabled stuff. So like the hack and leaks that we see a lot of. So really sophisticated global disinformation machine. And they use this machine with regard to their own population, right? To convince their own domestic population of all sorts of narratives. They use it in the Ukraine and in the region, right? And then they use it globally. So the way my team thinks of it is we look at really how Russia's propagating disinformation and how it's affecting all of those audiences, including Canadian audiences, right? So I think there's a couple interesting examples to look at in terms of trying to figure out, what impact is this Russian disinformation having here in Canada? And just to go back to the convoy protests, if we can, for example.
Please.
We looked at those in a lot of detail because they are a classic example of just the kind of event that our adversaries would take and use to leverage sort of fringe narratives to really try to polarize, right? But what we could tell from what we saw is that the majority of online content really came from folks in Canada and from transnational sort of non-state actors. So really a mixed bag of those who are ideologically motivated, some conspiracy folks, the COVID disinformation communities, and then really just average users. So Russia wasn't driving the conversation online, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't active. So what we saw was that Russia Today, so again, a Russian state-controlled media outlet, this is in no way free press at all, dedicated an unusually large amount of English and French language coverage to the convoy protests, way more generated in terms of texts and YouTube videos and all the rest with that one incident than all of the Canadian news, over the rest of the year, right? But from what we could tell, and this goes back to some of the things Colette was saying and some reasons for optimism from Holly, right, is that while the RT content was, popular among some niche Canadian and French political groups, right, on Facebook. By and large, Canadian social media users really were more likely to turn to established outlets like Global News or CBC to learn about these events. And I would just say we also didn't see the Kremlin or its affiliates sort of artificially amplifying the RT content. But I think now just looking at the Ukraine example, right? Because this is sort of the next great issue that everybody is focused on in Canada. We've been working with some non-government partners to try to understand how Russian disinformation might be affecting Russian and Ukrainian diaspora populations here in Canada, right, in the context of their invasion. And what's apparent is that beyond RT, and we know that the CRTC, an independent regulator, has decided that RT and RT France can't be distributed by Canadian television service providers. But of course, it's still accessible to Canadians in other ways. But beyond RT, Canada's Russian-speaking communities also access a host of Kremlin-affiliated TV channels, like their, kind of most notorious propaganda outlet is their Channel 1, right? Kremlin funded, and then some other pro-Kremlin channels like NTV or RTVI. And folks can access these channels through Canadian telecom companies and streaming services, both through smart TVs and privately owned streaming services. So it's out there. And the more that the Kremlin has cracked down on independent media outlets throughout Russia, it's really left Russian-speaking audiences in Canada with few other choices if they want to watch Russian-speaking media, right? But is this really convincing Canadians? And, we can go back to that really tricky and paralyzing discussion about impact and how do you determine impact of disinformation. But to turn to another survey results, and that's one of the few tools we have. There was a recent ECOS poll, I'm sure some of you have seen it, where they found that Canadians in general haven't been swayed by Russian disinformation and overwhelmingly blame Russia for the situation in Ukraine. So that's 83% of Canadians. But if Angus wants to do the math for me, that means that still 1 in 10, so 9% of Canadians assign responsibility to the US and its allies. And ECOS made the note that vaccine refusers are actually much more sympathetic to Russia than others in the Canadian population, suggesting that they might be targeted by disinformation. So I think this provides us with a bit of an indicator as to how this huge Russian disinformation machine may be having an impact on Canadians.
I think that's such an interesting point, that there's a convergence between pro-Russia and anti-vax content. That tells us a lot about some of the incentives that are going on in this system, I think, which is fascinating. I just want to get other people's thoughts on that RT question quickly. I was at a conference on journalism policy last week in New York, and it probably came up a dozen times that what do you do about RT, and should we be banning it or not? And it was people from different countries, and everyone was talking about how their broadcast regulators treated it differently. And Khalid, I'm sure you can't say one way or the other, but to others, what should we do about that? Should we be banning RT from our airwaves? And if so, should we then extend those into social platforms as well, those limitations?
Yeah, we're still working on that, the social platform
right. It's circulating everywhere, right?
But, for RT, I know that even some of my colleagues, academics, were saying, well, this amounts to censorship and it's playing the same game as the Russians, and there wasn't enough public debate. I understand those arguments, but I think the context, and there could have been maybe more pedagogy on what this actually means, how this content is produced, and in what strategy it, more people should be reading that report that Philippe mentioned. But but I think it was still a pretty marginal. I think symbolically it was a good move to do, but it was it didn't have that much impact one way or the other. It was really more to say we are doing this gesture, like many other things that Canada did in this conflict, is saying we are, and I wonder if the conflict isn't actually hurting misinformation, at least Russian misinformation, in the sense that a very large proportion of the population are actually turning against and actually realizing how much of this there is. But when you talked about the anti-vax, there's of course the conspiracy mindset, the idea that because there's a consensus in the media, which happens to be what the government is saying, well, then they are lying to us and they're beholden to the government. And you would see the same thing throughout the pandemic, like the fact that there is a pandemic, the fact that we have to wear masks, that we should be getting our vaccines, that is seen as the media just trumpeting and parroting the official line. And then, that just transfers into the war in the same fashion, because it's so consensual, it must be suspicious. That's the conspiracy mindset. And we've seen it on other issues before. And I guess the next one might be the climate or something. You know, they will, once this war ends, or there will be something else that they'll latch on to.
Yeah. There's a couple questions in the chat that touches something I wanted to raise as well, which is around how our visibility into certain spaces affects our understanding of this problem, and frankly, our lack of visibility in some spaces. And I wonder if, Holly, how you could reflect a bit on how you assess that. I mean, what we understand about this problem is very much a function of where we can collect data. And we know that a lot of these spaces are increasingly encrypted, they're increasingly private, they're increasingly not available via API to researchers. How do you reconcile that? What your optimism about the scale of the problem with our visibility, our limited visibility at the ecosystem?
Yeah, and it's not even just limited visibility for scholars who want to study it, but also for the sorts of organizations who are tasked with providing accurate information. So something like
100%,
Elections Canada, which has a great Twitter presence during the campaign in 2021, was trying to debunk as many myths as possible. Then the question comes, Elections Canada obviously would be slower to get on to some of the newer platforms. And then the question being, is it even appropriate for them to be on some platforms? So I think the thing that I've been thinking about during this whole talk so far is this idea that mis and disinformation is nothing new. It's always existed, but the speed at which it can kind of just rip through a debate is so quick. And even if like a reputable organization like Elections Canada comes back and says, oh, actually, no, it's not, you don't have to show proof of vaccination to go to the polls, has the damage already been done? Like a wildfire, is the damage just done and it's going to take years to build back the sorts of trust? That's one of the things that I'm most curious about, and as a researcher that I'm most interested in looking at is whether there is even a way that it can all get put back into the box after. And so this idea of it even going into places where we can't study it as researchers, or that the mechanisms that we're currently using, i.e. the fact-checking style mechanisms, are not appropriate to be placed. What then? Unfortunately, I guess that's where my optimism ends. And
I knew I'd find the limits. Angus, on that, I mean, there's another question here around what we know about Chinese interference. And I know that's something you looked at and have thoughts on from the report, but I also, you could almost reflect on that in this context of this as well, that it's not always easy to have visibility into the places where diaspora communities, for example, are participating online, or where foreign governments might be subtly influencing discourses. And there was a lot of talk about Chinese interference this election. I'm wondering if you could summarize what you found.
Yeah, maybe I'll first just take sort of the general question, which is just about how diffuse this space has become. And there's actually there's a bit of an interesting, for those of you in academia or who follow this stuff, that there's something really kind of interesting that happened where when social media platforms first emerged, we could get a lot of data, and the space got sort of swarmed by quantitative social scientists. And they got very excited. They have tons of data. They can do all sorts of networks and yay, brilliant. And that entire cohort, which has developed that skill set for looking at social media, now is turning to the current problem and saying, uh-oh, how do I map a network of Telegram channels? How do I map a network of anonymized platforms? How do I actually effectively do this? Can I collect enough data to use the methods that we've been using before? And the answer is no, they can't. And also it makes overtime comparisons very difficult. So it's very important to understand, is the scale of the problem getting worse or better? Are interventions helping or hurting? And if the platform ecosystem is changing so rapidly, it makes those it's this persistent challenge. So what I would say is today, if you're looking in the space, you need to be much better resourced than in the past. So you might have been able to get away just sort of English language Twitter and Facebook in the past, and that's where the action's happening, and that just isn't true anymore. You need a team with a diversity of languages. You need a team with a diversity of social media expertises. You need people who speak sort of fairly eccentric languages, like not languages like linguistic tics. Like you need to know the vernacular of the community that you're going into. So there's this real resourcing challenge that I think everyone sort of doing work in this space is coming up against. Canada is home to just a thriving sort of set of ethnocultural communities that all, that have their own media ecosystems, and trying to understand that is challenging. And like if we talk about Chinese interference in the last election, there's a lot of news about this, about Chinese interference. There was misinformation spread about some incumbent members of parliament and the Conservative Party on WeChat. And it's difficult to talk about the provenance of that information, but there were a lot of claims that they really were interfering in the Canadian election. And we tried to evaluate it using survey measures and sort of using some like large scale social media metrics. And by sort of the traditional measures that you would evaluate this, we would say that there wasn't an effect of this interference. If there was interference, it was sort of very low, minimal effort, and there wasn't a large effect. But that doesn't mean that some Canadians weren't convinced, and it doesn't mean that maybe in one riding it actually did make a big difference. And most importantly, it doesn't mean that going forward, if you're a Chinese Canadian and you're interested in running for politics, that you might be fearful of the Chinese state retaliating against you. And our report will have a lot of details sort of on that, and I think it's sort of a really interesting question. So while we didn't see sort of that misinformation mattering in the last Canadian election, again, I think the weight of the trend is not in our favor here. I don't, maybe I'm just the pessimist on the panel, but I don't see like Canadians getting more confident in elections or more factually aligned in subsequent years. I actually see the reverse. And if I was a foreign actor, you can put on your little game hat here and go like, how would I attack a Canadian election? How would I attack sort of the Canadian information ecosystem? You have a lot of vectors of attack today that you didn't have 5 years ago. You have a lot of different ways to do it. Whereas in the past, you might have just, let's fire up the Twitter bots, let's go. That's one way. But now there's a whole plethora of vectors, and that's troubling. And hey, Lee, that's your challenge, I think, in large part. Not just that, but that's a huge challenge is to sort of try to think about what would the other, if I was a Russian trying to interfere in Canada, how would I do it? And I think targeting this community with the conspiratorial mindset that is predisposed to believe anything that goes against sort of the mainstream narrative, jackpot, jackpot. Like that's where you can focus your efforts.
Yeah. All right, so we're probably coming against time here, but look, I'm sitting in a policy school at the moment, and seems to me like this is a pretty prescient public policy challenge. And so I'd love to just ask a final question to everybody about what they think the most meaningful policy levers are here. As Glade said, the government's tried a number of things domestically, and I think some of it's had a real impact, particularly on election integrity. But we're heading into a space where there's going to be significantly more online harms regulation, probably more regulation around elections. And I'm just curious what you all think are the most important things here that governments can be doing. And there's a question here from Phaedra about the international implications of that. So Glade, I can let you off the hook domestically, but like I'd love to get your sense on like the international dimensions here. Like what can we be doing in terms of foreign policy to help with this problem? Like, is it new institutions? Is it more collaboration? Is it like what can we be doing internationally?
So I don't want to be let totally off the hook on the domestic side. And
okay, by all means. All right, I was trying to help you out there, but like, go for it.
On the domestic side, again, at the risk of repeating myself, I really think it's the societal resilience piece, right?
Yeah.
I really think that we as the government, and I think there's certainly a move in the right direction, need to invest in a vibrant Canadian civil society that can raise digital literacy and awareness, that can monitor these sorts of things and report on them. And again, not to throw too many shout outs in people's way, but I think support for groups like the Digital Media Ecosystem Observatory is absolutely key. So that's on the domestic side. On the international side of things, and I know this is going to sound awfully philosophical, but I think one of the biggest challenges in getting around common solutions is definitional, right? disinformation really defies definition. It goes to one man's freedom fighter. And I think it's the same thing about one man's truth, right? And starting to determine what's mis and what's disinformation, what's foreign, what's domestic, what's overt, what's covert. I think as long as we don't have sort of an agreement on what disinformation is, it makes it hard for us to start developing the things that we as diplomats do, which are some international norms, right? Which are the rules of the road. So we all agree, this is what we call out, this is what we can live with. And it's a really tricky space. I think Angus was helpfully talking about some of the trends earlier, right? That the badly misspelled Russian lies propagated by all these bots, those are, we yearn for those days because that's when life was simpler, right? And now we're seeing all sorts of new trends that complicate the space. And one of them, right, is sort of the mingling of the foreign and domestic, right? Where the bad guys, instead of introducing their own lies, are taking fringe narratives in our own societies and sort of amplifying them and feeding them, right? Which makes it hard for us to address these things, because in democracies, as long as it's not illegal, right? And there's very few things that are illegal to say in democracies, you can say whatever you want and it doesn't matter if it's true, right? That's what it means to sort of live in a democracy. And the other piece in terms of definitional challenges is what's overt and covert. We always think of foreign interference and disinformation as that covert stuff, right? Just look at the definition in the CSIS Act here in Canada. But, if a country's diplomats are going to stand up and very overtly state things that are very much false, right? Or if their state-linked press is going to report things, again, in a very overt way, but that is very much false, does that fall into the kind of disinformation that we should, take action against? So I would just go back to the fact that I think we, as like-minded, at least in the international community, really need to put our heads together on what constitutes disinformation, where we can draw the lines, where we can't, and start to do some of that normative work. And I'll stop there to give others a chance.
Yeah. And again, if we all think each other are disinformed, that's a really hard starting point. If everybody thinks everybody else is wrong. Holly, do you want to jump in on policy? Then I'll go to Colette and Angus to wrap it up.
Yeah, I think I'll give two answers. And I'm also largely focusing kind of in this international sphere of elections. If you're looking kind of top-down institutional, investing in well-resourced, well-trained and independent election management bodies, I think that's one of the things that protects Canada from some of the issues that we see in other places. And continuing to invest. It's not like once you have a high quality election management body, you could just say, okay, good, we're good to go. But I think looking at Elections Canada and the way that they dealt with what could have been clear issues and then comparing that to the United States, I think from the top-down approach, an investment in electoral management is key. From a bottom-up approach, one thing I'm starting to think a lot more about, and I don't have like a policy solution for it, but something I like to study more is, and we've definitely talked about it, is that disinformation affects different communities differently. And that as scholars, like Angus was saying, looking at population levels no longer cuts it. And so I think some of that's going to have to be diversifying the space of who is working in this area. What kind of scholars are we training? Are they coming from these diverse communities?
And what methods are they using? Not just,
exactly. And so that's something, obviously, as a policy, it needs to get fleshed out, but thinking more about who's doing the research and work in this space and diversifying that, I think is on the grassroots level, one of the key ways forward.
Yeah, thanks. Colette?
Yeah, I'm already coming after some things I would have liked to say, but were said better. For sure, any kind of intervention to suppress disinformation becomes really thorny. We live in a free speech society, and that's actually, as Galit said, it's actually exploited as a vulnerability by disinformation. But it still is one of our strengths, and we want to protect that. So, we do tend to look more to feeding or supporting a demand and supply of quality content as opposed to suppressing. They're not policy initiatives, but some of them are supported by public funds, private initiatives to demonetize disinformation. Angus and I were part of a study on one of them, but there are several, and trying to help the audience navigate content. But we're talking about audiences who are sincerely looking for quality content, not people who are looking for conspiratorial content. That's those kinds of groups require special attention and very granular studies, maybe even qualitative research. What about that? But that's going to be the toughest part of it, is getting to the more radical groups and not thinking of this just as a foreign interference problem, but also as a social problem, that a social failure, in a sense, that these people have become isolated and are connecting with a completely different information ecosystem.
Angus, as the pessimist today, do you have an optimistic note to
I do.
bring us home on? Yeah.
I do. I think there's been some great points raised so far. One of the things I spend a lot of times in these communities, I think that one of the most effective things we can do as a society is make sure that the groups that they distrust and that they're continuously looking for like missteps, for errors, for misinformation spread by scientists or government or by media, is for those groups to be really good at what they do and to be supported in being really good at what they do. When, CBC puts a foot out of line and reports on a story, Colette, you talked a little bit about this earlier. I mean, it's a high pressure job. It's challenging to get everything right all the time. And the second a foot is out of step, it's pounced upon as evidence of, media incompetency. They use it as ammunition. And so trying to prevent that, trying to deprive that of oxygen, I think is a huge part of the public policy challenge, and something that, all the researchers and myself included in the space, like we just really need to be careful about how we talk about things and to be really good at what we do, which, sometimes we are, sometimes we aren't.
I like that all three academics suggested that more and better research is the policy solution to this problem. So, it's pretty predictable. I tend to agree. So, all right. Well, look, thank you everybody for such a wonderful conversation. That was really rich. I really enjoyed it. Look out for the Ecosystem Observatory report coming out next week-ish. We'll be promoting that around, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in the months and years ahead with all of you. So thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks,
Taylor. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.